The snow had not stopped falling for 3 days. Sylvain knelt at the edge of the greywood, her knees buried in a drift that reached her thighs, and pressed her ear to the chest of the dying pup in her arms. His heartbeat was a threadbare whisper, a sound so faint that the wind nearly swallowed it whole. She had been walking for 9 hours, 9 hours through a blizzard that had turned the world into a howling white void. 9 hours with a child who weighed almost nothing and yet had grown heavier with every mile, not because of his body, but because of the silence, the terrible, creeping silence between his breaths that stretched longer each time. "Stay with me," she whispered, pulling him tighter against her chest. "Please, just a little longer." The pup did not respond. His lips had turned the color of bruised thistle. Frost clung to his lashes in tiny crystals that caught the last gray light of afternoon. He was 4 years old, maybe 5, small even for that age, his ribs visible beneath the torn remnants of a nightshirt that had once been fine linen. The kind of linen that servants in the great houses were forbidden to touch. But it was the wound that made Saven's stomach clench every time she looked at it. A gash ran from his left shoulder to the base of his ribs, deep enough to expose the pale gleam of bone beneath. The edges were blackened, not from infection, but from something far worse. The skin around the wound carried the unmistakable scorch of wolfsbane, pressed directly into open flesh. Someone had not just tried to kill this child, someone had tried to make sure he could never heal. Saven adjusted her grip, wincing as the movement sent a spike of pain through her own battered body. Her feet were beyond feeling. Her fingers had stopped aching an hour ago, which she knew was dangerous. And the thin cloak she had wrapped around them both was soaked through, offering about as much warmth as a sheet of wet parchment. She was an Omega, the lowest rank in the hierarchy of wolves. No pack to call her own, no bloodline worth naming, no power that any alpha would consider worth acknowledging. She survived on the margins, trading her knowledge of herbs and healing for scraps of shelter in villages that tolerated her presence, as long as she remained useful and invisible. She should not have been here. She should not have been anywhere near the burning ruins of the Ashenmere estate when the screaming started. Should not have followed the sound of a child's cries through smoke so thick it turned her lungs to cinders. Should not have found the boy bleeding in a shattered nursery while flames consumed the walls around him, and the bodies of his guards lay motionless on the floor. But she had. And when she had lifted him from the wreckage, when his small hand had closed around her finger with a grip that was more reflex than intention, something inside Saven had locked into place. A decision that was not a decision at all, but something deeper. Something that lived in the marrow of her bones and the oldest part of her wolf. This child would not die tonight. Not if she had breath left in her body to prevent it. The tree line broke, and Saven staggered into the open. Below her, nestled in the valley where two frozen rivers met, the lights of Dunhallow flickered through the storm. Smoke rose from 100 chimneys. The great bonfire in the town square blazed like a beacon, surrounded by the dark shapes of wolves in both human and animal form. The Dunhallow Pack, 300 strong, led by Alpha Vasek, a wolf known for his rigid adherence to the old laws and his deep suspicion of outsiders. Saven had never spoken to Vasek, had never set foot in his territory. Under normal circumstances, an Omega approaching an Alpha's seat of power uninvited would be met with teeth and a warning that would leave scars. But these were not normal circumstances. She pressed her lips to the pup's forehead. His skin was so cold it burned against her mouth. "Just a little longer," she said again. "There are healers here. Real ones, with proper supplies and warm beds. They will help you." She did not let herself consider the alternative. The descent into the valley nearly killed her twice. Her legs buckled on an icy slope, and she went down hard, curling her body around the pup to absorb the impact with her spine. Pain exploded through her back, sharp and white-hot, but she forced herself upright and kept moving. The second time, The snow gave way beneath her feet entirely, and she slid 15 yards down a frozen embankment, clutching the child to her chest as rocks tore through her cloak and opened cuts along her arms. By the time she reached the first buildings of Dunhallow, she was leaving a trail of blood on the frozen ground behind her. The wolves noticed her before she reached the square. 3 sentries in shifted form materialized from the shadows between buildings, their ears flat, their hackles raised. They circled her with the practiced coordination of a patrol that had done this 1,000 times. Saven stopped walking. She held the pup close and kept her chin low, exposing her throat in the universal gesture of submission. "I am not a threat," she said. Her voice came out cracked and raw. "I am an Omega. I have no pack, and I carry no challenge. But this child is dying. He needs a healer, please." One of the sentries shifted to human form, a young male with suspicious eyes and a jaw clenched tight against the cold. "No outsiders," he said flatly. "Alpha's orders. Turn around." "He is a child." Saven heard her voice rising and could not stop it. "He is 4 years old, and he has been cut with wolfsbane, and he will be dead before morning if someone does not treat his wounds. I am begging you." The sentry's gaze dropped to the pup. Something flickered in his expression, a crack in the wall of trained indifference. "Wait here," he said. He disappeared into the storm. The other 2 sentries remained, their amber eyes fixed on Saven with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She stood in the falling snow, her arms shaking with the effort of holding the child, and tried to keep her teeth from chattering so violently that she bit through her own tongue. Minutes passed. Each one felt like a year. Then the sentry returned, and he was not alone. Alpha Vasek was a massive wolf even in human form. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, his shoulders as broad as a doorframe, his gray streaked beard braided in the old northern style. He wore a fur-lined cloak over bare arms that were roped with muscle and covered in the ritual scars of 100 dominance challenges. He looked at Saven with eyes the color of frozen iron. Then he looked at the pup. And something in his expression changed. Not softened. Not exactly. But shifted, as if a calculation was being performed behind those cold gray eyes. A rapid assessment of risk and reward, of politics and consequence, of the dozen things an alpha had to weigh before making any decision that might affect his pack. "Where did you find this child?" Vasek asked. His voice was deep and carried the weight of absolute authority. "The Ashenmere estate. It was burning. Everyone was dead except him." Vasek's jaw tightened. The Ashenmere. It was not a question. And the way he said it, with the careful flatness of a man who already knew something terrible and was choosing how much to reveal, sent ice through Saven's veins that had nothing to do with the blizzard. "You know what happened there," she said. Vasek did not answer. Instead, he reached out and tilted the pup's face toward the torchlight. His thick fingers were surprisingly gentle. He studied the boy's features for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he pulled his hand back, as if the child's skin had burned him. "Take the pup and go," Vasek said. Saven blinked. "What?" "You heard me. Leave Dunhallow. Now. Tonight. He is dying." The words came out as a plea, and Saven hated herself for the desperation in her voice. "Alpha Vasek, please. I am not asking for shelter or food or protection. I am asking you to let your healers close a wound on a child who cannot close it himself. And I am telling you to leave." Vasek's voice dropped to a register that made the sentries flinch. "That child is not welcome in my territory. If you are wise, Omega, you will put him down in the snow and walk away before whatever follows him arrives at your door." The words hit Saven like a fist to the chest. Put him down in the snow. She stared at the Alpha of Dunhallow, this towering figure of power and authority, and saw something she had not expected to find in the eyes of a wolf who commanded 300 warriors. Fear. Vasek was afraid of a dying child. What is he? Soven whispered. But Vasek had already turned his back. He strode toward the great hall without another word, his guards falling into step behind him. The sentries closed ranks, forming a wall of fur and muscle between Soven and the warmth of Dunhallow. The message was clear. The door was closed. The pup was not welcome. And if she remained, she would share whatever fate Vasek believed was coming for the boy in her arms. Soven stood alone in the snow, blood dripping from her arms, the child pressed against her chest, and watched the lights of Dunhallow blur through her tears. Behind her, the storm howled like a living thing. Ahead of her, the wilderness stretched in every direction, vast and white and merciless. And in her arms, the pup's heartbeat stuttered, then steadied, then stuttered again. Soven pressed her cheek to his frozen hair and made a choice that would change the course of kingdoms. She turned her back on Dunhallow and walked into the storm. She had found him by accident. 3 hours before the blizzard swallowed the world, Soven had been doing what she always did, surviving. She had been gathering winter moss from the banks of the Ashenmere River, the bitter green plant that brewed into a tea capable of breaking even the most stubborn fever. A farmer's wife in the nearest village had a sick infant, and Soven had promised to return before nightfall, with enough moss to see the child through the worst of it. The Ashenmere estate sat on a hill above the river, visible but untouchable. A sprawling manor of dark stone and ancient timber, surrounded by walls that had stood for 6 generations. The seat of a bloodline so old that even alphas spoke its name with careful deference. Soven had never been inside those walls, had never had reason to be. The Ashenmere wolves kept to themselves, a small but fiercely private pack that had refused every alliance, every treaty, and every attempt by the greater houses to absorb them into the political machinery of the realm. They answered to no alpha council. They bent the knee to no king, which was, Soven would later understand, exactly why they had been destroyed. She smelled the smoke before she saw the flames. It came on the wind like a living thing, thick and acrid and wrong. Not the clean smoke of a hearth fire or a clearing burn. This was the choking black reek of something deliberate, something designed to consume. Soven had dropped her basket of winter moss and run toward the estate without thinking. Later, she would marvel at her own stupidity. An omega running toward a burning stronghold, a packless wolf charging into a disaster that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with powers far beyond her understanding. But she had heard the screaming. Not the screams of adults, which she might have been able to rationalize away as none of her concern, but the high, thin wail of a child, cutting through the roar of flame and the crash of collapsing timber with a clarity that reached inside her chest and squeezed. The gates of the Ashenmere estate hung from their hinges, twisted and blackened. Beyond them, the courtyard was a slaughterhouse. Soven had seen death before. Every wolf who lived on the margins had. But this was different. This was not the aftermath of a challenge or a border skirmish. This was annihilation. Bodies lay scattered across the frozen stones, guards and servants alike, cut down by blades wielded with brutal efficiency. Some were in wolf form. Some had died mid-shift, their bodies frozen in grotesque states between human and animal, and every single one of them had been killed with wolfsbane weapons. The realization stopped Soven cold. Wolfsbane was rare, expensive, and strictly controlled by the Alpha Council. Possessing it without authorization was a crime punishable by exile. Using it against another wolf was an act of war. Whoever had attacked the Ashenmere had not come for a fight. They had come for an execution. The child's screaming had stopped by the time Soven found him. He was in the nursery on the upper floor, curled beneath an overturned cradle that had partially shielded him from the flames. The room was an inferno. The ceiling had begun to sag, dropping burning debris in sheets of ember and ash. Sauven's lungs screamed as she crawled through the smoke, her eyes streaming, her skin blistering from the heat. But she reached him. The boy was unconscious, his small body limp and terrifyingly still. The wound on his chest was fresh, the edges still weeping blood that had turned black where the wolfsbane had touched it. His nightshirt, that fine linen that spoke of wealth and status, was soaked through with crimson. Beside him, crumpled against the wall, lay the body of a woman, a wolf, judging by the silver threading through her dark hair and the claiming mark visible on her throat. She had died with her arms outstretched toward the cradle, as if her last act on earth had been to push the child beneath its shelter. His mother. Sauven had no time for grief. The ceiling groaned above her, a sound of imminent collapse. She scooped the boy into her arms, flinching at how light he was, and ran. The manor came down behind her as she cleared the gates, a thunderous implosion of stone and timber that sent a pillar of sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. The blast of heat knocked Sauven off her feet. She hit the frozen ground hard, twisting to keep the pup from taking the impact. For a long moment she lay on the frozen earth, staring up at the burning skeleton of a house that had stood for centuries. The pup was motionless in her arms. She pressed her fingers to his throat and found a pulse so faint it might have been a memory. That was when the blizzard had begun. And that was when Sauven had started walking. She had known, even then, that she could not save him alone. She had basic healing skills. She could clean a wound and bind it. She could brew teas and poultices that eased pain and fought infection. But wolfsbane poisoning was beyond her. The toxin was already in his blood, spreading through his small body with every weakening heartbeat. Without an alpha healer, someone with the power to burn the poison out at its root, the child would be dead before dawn. The nearest pack was Dunhallow, and Dunhallow had turned them away. Now, as Sauven trudged through the deepening snow with the storm tearing at her cloak and the pup's breathing growing shallower by the minute, she understood something that settled into her bones like a second cold. Vasek had recognized the child. The alpha had looked at the pup's face and seen something that frightened him badly enough to refuse aid to a dying boy. Had told her to put him down in the snow. Had warned her that something was coming for whatever the child represented. Sauven looked down at the small face pressed against her collarbone. Pale skin, dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat and snowmelt. A straight nose. High cheekbones that would sharpen as he grew. Features that meant nothing to an Omega who had never seen the inside of a great hall, but apparently meant everything to an Alpha who had. "Who are you?" she murmured. The pup shivered in his unconsciousness, a full-body tremor that shook his tiny frame. Sauven pressed him closer, trying to share what little warmth her body still produced. Her wolf stirred beneath her skin, restless and anxious, pushing against the walls of her consciousness with an urgency she had never felt before. "Protect," the wolf insisted. A single word, primal and absolute. "I am trying," Sauven whispered back. She scanned the horizon through the curtain of falling snow. To the north, the mountains rose like the broken teeth of some ancient beast. To the south, flatlands stretched toward territories she had never traveled. And to the east, perhaps half a day's walk if the storm did not worsen, lay the border of the Grenith pack. Alpha Grenith was said to be different from Vasek. Younger, less bound by tradition, a wolf who had earned his position through wisdom rather than brute force. Perhaps Grenith would see a wounded child and feel something other than fear. Perhaps. It was not much of a hope, but it was all Sauven had. She shifted the pup to her other arm, gritted her teeth against the pain that radiated through every inch of her frozen body, and set her course east. Behind her, lost in the storm, the ruins of the Ashenmere estate collapsed into their own ashes. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the blizzard, something moved through the trees. something that followed the scent of blood and wolfsbane with patient, predatory precision. Sylvain did not hear it. She did not see the dark shapes that paused at the fringe of the tree line to watch her stumbling figure grow smaller in the white expanse. But her wolf felt them. And deep in her ribcage, beneath the exhaustion and the fear and the desperate determination to keep this child alive, a growl began to build. Dawn came without sunlight. The sky shifted from black to a flat, oppressive gray that offered no warmth and no hope. The blizzard had not relented. If anything, it had grown teeth. The wind drove ice crystals into Sauven's face like needles of ground glass, and the snow had risen past her knees in the open stretches, turning every step into a battle against a world that seemed determined to swallow her whole. The pup had not woken, but he was still breathing, and Sauven clung to that fact like a rope over an abyss. His small chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular rhythms. His skin had gone from cold to something beyond cold, a waxy pallor that made him look carved from candle tallow. And the wound on his chest, that terrible, wolfsbane blackened gash, had begun to smell. Not the smell of rot, not yet, but a bitter, chemical sharpness that Sauven recognized from her years of treating injuries in the villages where she was tolerated. The poison was working its way deeper into his tissue, killing the flesh around the wound inch by inch, creating a spreading ring of dead skin that would eventually reach his heart. She had tried everything she knew. She had packed the wound with winter moss from the small pouch she carried in her belt, the same moss she had been gathering when the world had caught fire. The plant had modest healing properties, enough to slow bleeding and draw out minor poisons. Against wolfsbane, it was like trying to hold back a river with a handful of pebbles. She had chewed birch bark until her mouth was raw and pressed the paste against the blackened edges. It bought minutes, maybe. Nothing more. She had even tried something she had never done before and was not sure she had the ability to do. She had pressed her hands flat against the wound and reached inside herself for the place where her wolf lived, searching for some thread of healing power, some spark of the gift that alpha healers wielded with such effortless authority. She had found nothing. Omegas did not heal. That was the immutable law of the hierarchy. Omegas endured. Omegas submitted. Omegas survived on the scraps that more powerful wolves discarded. The power to mend flesh and purge poison was reserved for those who stood at the top of the bloodline, not the bottom. But the absence of power did not diminish the fury that burned in Sauven's chest as she walked. A quiet, steady fire that refused to die despite the cold, despite the exhaustion, despite every rational voice in her head that told her this was a fight she could not win. She reached the border of the Greneth territory as the gray morning light hit its peak. The Greneth pack marked their lands with carved stone pillars, each one etched with the image of a running wolf and planted at intervals along the ridgeline. Sauven passed between two of them and felt the faint tingle of a boundary ward prickle across her skin, an alarm designed to alert the pack that something had crossed into their domain. Good. Let them come. Let them see. She did not have to wait long. A patrol found her within the hour. 6 wolves in shifted form, their coats a uniform russet brown that marked them as Greneth-born. They surrounded her without aggression, their postures wary but not hostile, and one of them shifted to human form. A female. Young, sharp-featured, with close-cropped hair and intelligent dark eyes that swept over Sauven's battered appearance with quick assessment. "You are trespassing," the female said. Not a threat, a statement of fact. "I know." Sauven was beyond pretense, beyond diplomacy, beyond anything except the raw truth. "My name is Sauven. I am an Omega. I carry no challenge, no agenda, no allegiance to any enemy of this pack. But I have a child in my arms who has been poisoned with wolfsbane, and if your healers do not treat him in the next few hours, he will die. I tried Dunhallow. They refused." The female's eyes widened slightly at the mention of Dunhallow's refusal. She stepped closer and looked at the pup. And there it was again. That same flicker. That same moment of recognition followed by something that looked very much like fear. The female's nostrils flared, and Sauven saw her eyes dart to the other wolves in the patrol, exchanging a look that carried volumes of unspoken communication. "Wait here," the female said. "I will bring the alpha." She shifted and vanished into the forest at a dead run. Sauven sank to her knees on the frozen ground, no longer able to support her own weight. The remaining wolves watched her with expressions that hovered between pity and apprehension. One of them, a large male with a scar across his muzzle, padded close enough to sniff the pup. He recoiled immediately, a whine building in his throat. He looked at Sauven with eyes that held something she could not quite name. Not fear, this time. Sorrow. "You know who he is," Sauven said to the wolf. "All of you know." The wolf turned away without answering. Alpha Greneth arrived with the speed of a leader who had been warned that something dangerous was waiting at his border. He came in human form, flanked by 4 warriors, his stride long and purposeful. He was younger than Vasek, perhaps 40, with a lean build and a face that bore more lines of thought than violence. A scholar's face, Sauven thought, on a warrior's frame. He stopped 3 paces from where she knelt. "Show me the child," he said. Sauven turned the pup in her arms so that Greneth could see his face. The alpha's reaction was subtler than Vasek's, but no less damning. His lips pressed into a thin line. His hands, which had been loose at his sides, curled into fists. And behind his carefully composed expression, Sauven saw the same calculation she had witnessed in Dunhallow. The same weighing of mercy against survival. "You found him at the Ashenmere," Greneth said. Not a question. "Yes." "And you know what the Ashenmere was?" "A bloodline, an old one. That is all I know." Greneth studied her for a long moment. Then he knelt on the cold earth across from her, bringing himself to her eye level. The gesture was deliberate. A wolf of his rank did not kneel before an Omega without reason. "What the Ashenmere was," Greneth said carefully, "is a problem that powerful wolves have been trying to solve for a very long time. The child you carry is not just a pup from a noble house, Omega. He is the last living heir of a bloodline that half the Alpha Council wants extinct." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. "Why?" Sauven demanded. Greneth's jaw worked. She could see him wrestling with how much to say, how much truth an Omega deserved, how much knowledge might make her dangerous. "Because his father was Kavrin," Greneth said finally, "the Alpha King of Irindril." The ground tilted beneath Sauven's knees. The Alpha King. Every wolf in the realm knew the name. Kavrin, who had united the fractured packs under a single crown for the first time in 300 years. Kavrin, whose power was said to rival the wolves of legend. Kavrin, who had vanished from public life 6 months ago amid rumors of illness, betrayal, and a court that had closed around his throne like a fist. "That is impossible," Sauven breathed. "The Alpha King has no heir. It was declared by the council. His line ended with nothing." Greneth's voice hardened. "His line was supposed to end. That was the arrangement. House Catherine and their allies on the council made sure of it. The attack on the Ashenmere was not random violence, Omega. It was the final step in a plan that has been unfolding for years." Sauven looked down at the child in her arms. The Alpha King's son. The heir to a kingdom that had been told he did not exist. "Then help him," she said, and her voice shook with something far more dangerous than desperation. "If he is what you say he is, then every pack in this realm should be fighting to save his life, not turning him away like a stray dog." Greneth closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the sympathy in his expression was genuine and devastating. "Every pack in this realm should do many things," he said, "but House Catherine controls the Alpha Council. Lord Halvard's wolves outnumber mine 3-1. If I take this child into my territory, if I am seen giving shelter to a heir that Halvard has declared dead, the Kethrin will march on my borders before the week is out. He paused. I have 400 wolves under my protection. Families, children of my own. I cannot sacrifice them for one boy, no matter whose blood runs in his veins. Soveni stared at him. She understood the logic. She even, in some hollow, rational corner of her mind, respected it. An alpha's first duty was to his pack. Greneth was not being cruel. He was being a leader, making the calculation that every alpha was trained to make from the moment they first shifted. But understanding did not stop the rage from rising in her throat like bile. So you will let him die, she said flatly. Greneth flinched. I will let him live, by staying out of a conflict that would destroy my pack and still not save him. House Kethrin will find him eventually, Omega. They have eyes everywhere, scouts in every territory. The only reason they have not found him yet is the storm. He stood, brushing snow from his knees. My advice to you is the same as whatever Vasek told you. Put the child down. Walk away. Forget what you have seen. Vasek told me to leave him in the snow to die. Then Vasek is a harder wolf than I am. I am telling you to give yourself a chance to survive. Greneth turned to leave. Then he stopped. Without looking back, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. There is a healer in the mountains, beyond the Greywood, past the Frostjaw Pass. An old woman named Brita. She was exiled from the packs decades ago for reasons no one speaks of anymore. She owes no allegiance to any alpha or any council. He paused. I did not tell you this. Then he was gone, his wolves melting into the forest behind him, leaving Soven alone once more with a dying prince, and a name whispered into the wind. Brita. Past the Frostjaw Pass. Soven looked at the mountains that rose to the north, their peaks lost in cloud and storm. The Greywood was a day's walk in good weather. In this blizzard, with a wounded child and a body that was beginning to fail, it might as well have been on the other side of the world. But it was a direction, a purpose, a thread of hope so thin it might snap at the first hard pull. Soven touched her fingertips to the pup's temple, brushing the damp hair aside. Your name, she whispered. If you can hear me, if you are still in there, I need to know your name. Silence, the wind, the creak of frozen branches. Then, so faint she might have imagined it, a breath of sound against her throat. Revan. The word was barely a whisper. The ghost of a voice from a child who had been unconscious for hours. Soven's vision blurred. She blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall where they would only freeze against her cheeks. Revan, she repeated. My name is Soven. I am going to carry you through these mountains, and I am going to find someone who can heal you, and I need you to do one thing for me. She stood. Her legs screamed in protest. Every joint, every muscle, every inch of frozen skin cried out for her to stop, to rest, to accept the inevitable. She ignored all of it. Do not die, she said. That is all I ask. Just do not die. She turned north toward the mountains, toward the Greywood and the Frostjaw Pass and a healer who might not exist, and began to walk. Behind her, the Greneth patrol watched from the tree line. Not one of them moved to follow. And in the deepening storm, the dark shapes that had been tracking her since the Ashenmere drew closer, patient as wolves on the hunt, waiting for the moment when her strength finally gave out. The Greywood swallowed them whole. Soven had heard stories about this forest since she was old enough to understand language. The wolves who lived on the margins spoke of it in whispers, a place where the trees grew so dense that sunlight never touched the ground, where the snow lay undisturbed for entire seasons because no wind could penetrate the canopy. A forest that predated the packs themselves, a forest where things lived that were older than wolves. She had dismissed those stories as superstition. fireside tales designed to keep pups from wandering too far into the dark. But now, standing at the edge of the gray wood with the storm raging behind her and the silence ahead of her pressing against her ears like a held breath, Sylvain felt the superstition crawl up her spine and settle there. The trees were massive, ancient pines whose trunks were wider than three wolves standing shoulder to shoulder, their bark blackened with age and hung with beards of frozen lichen. Their branches interlocked overhead in a lattice so thick that the blizzard, which had been tearing at Sauvin's cloak for hours, simply stopped. One step past the tree line and the wind died. The snow fell in scattered drifts rather than driving sheets. The silence was worse than the storm. Revan stirred against her chest, the first conscious movement he had made since whispering his name at the Grenith border. His small fingers tightened on the fabric of her tunic, and a sound escaped his lips that was not quite a word and not quite a whimper. Shh. Sauvain adjusted her hold on him, trying to find a position that did not press against the wound. The toxin had continued its slow destruction. The blackened edges had spread another finger width since Dunhallow, and the smell had grown sharper. A metallic bitterness that coated the back of her throat. She needed to stop, needed to rest, needed to examine the wound properly and apply what little she had left in her medicine pouch. She needed to keep moving. The Frostjaw Pass, according to the fragments of geography she had pieced together from trader gossip and old maps glimpsed in village archives, lay on the far side of the Greywood. A narrow gap in the mountain range that was passable only in the brief window between autumn storms and the deep freeze of true winter. That window had closed weeks ago. Sauvain pushed deeper into the forest, her feet finding a rhythm on the frozen ground that was more mechanical than intentional. Step, breathe, step, breathe. Do not think about the distance. Do not calculate the hours. Do not count the number of times the pup's breathing has stuttered since the last time you checked. Do not think about the shapes you saw at the tree line, because she had seen them. Just before the greywood swallowed the horizon behind her, Sauvain had glanced back and caught movement at the border of the forest. Dark figures, upright, not in wolf form. 4 of them, standing in the white expanse where her tracks were still visible, watching her disappear into the trees. Not following, not yet, waiting. The first hour in the Greywood passed in grim silence. Sauvain navigated by instinct, keeping the faint downhill gradient to her left, which she hoped meant the mountain foothills were to her right. The trees offered shelter from the wind, but not from the cold. If anything, the still air felt colder than the blizzard, a deep, penetrating chill that settled into her joints and turned her muscles to wood. She talked to Revan as she walked. Not because she expected answers, but because the sound of her own voice was the only thing keeping the silence from driving her mad. "My mother was an Omega too," she said. "She told me once that our rank was not a punishment, that it was a position, like any other. That someone had to stand at the bottom so the rest could stand on top. Step. Breathe." I believed her when I was small. I stopped believing her when I watched an alpha break her arm for failing to lower her eyes quickly enough. Step. Breathe. She died that winter. Not from the arm. From the cold. Because the pack she served decided that an Omega with a broken arm was not worth feeding. The words came out flat. Without bitterness. She had burned through bitterness years ago. What remained was something harder, colder. A determination that had been forged in the furnace of a life spent being told she was worth nothing and refusing, day after day, to believe it. "That will not happen to you," she told the unconscious child. "Whatever you are, whoever your father was, you will not die because powerful wolves decided you were inconvenient." Revan's fingers tightened on her tunic again. A reflex, probably, but Sauvain chose to believe it was agreement. The second hour brought the first sign that the Greywood was not empty. She heard it before she saw it. a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from the trees themselves, vibrating through the frozen trunks and into the ground beneath her feet. It was not a threatening sound, not exactly, but it carried a weight of attention that made the hair on her arms rise. Something was aware of them. Sylvain kept walking. Her wolf was alert, ears pricked inside her consciousness, but not panicked. Whatever lived in the graywood, her instincts were not reading it as predatory, at least not yet. The hum faded, the silence returned, and Sylvain pushed on. By the third hour, her body began to betray her. It started with her vision. The edges of her sight grew soft, blurring the already dim forest into smears of black and gray. She stumbled more frequently, her frozen feet catching on roots she could no longer see. Twice she walked directly into low branches, the impact splitting the skin on her forehead and sending warm blood running down her face. She was dehydrating, starving. Her body was consuming itself to fuel the walk, burning through fat and then muscle in a desperate attempt to keep her core temperature above the threshold of death. And the pup was growing heavier. Not actually heavier, she knew that. Revan weighed no more than a sack of grain, but her arms had been holding him for nearly 18 hours straight, and the muscles had passed through pain into a kind of numb screaming that made every adjustment of her grip feel like she was lifting a boulder. She sat down against a tree to rest, just for a moment. Just long enough to rewrap the cloak around Revan and check his wound. The wound was worse. The blackened edges had reached his collarbone. Dark veins of poisoned blood were visible beneath his skin, spreading outward from the gash like the roots of a dead tree. His breathing had gone from shallow to barely perceptible. Sylvain pressed her ear to his chest. His heartbeat was a ghost, a tremor, a sound like the last leaf clinging to a dead branch. "No," she whispered. "Not yet. You do not get to leave yet." She rummaged in her medicine pouch with fingers that could barely close. The winter moss was gone. The birch bark was gone. All that remained was a small twist of dried foxglove, a stimulant that was dangerous in adults and potentially lethal in children. She looked at the foxglove, looked at the boy, calculated the dose in her head, knowing she was guessing, knowing a guess could kill him as easily as the wolfsbane. But the poison would kill him for certain. The foxglove was a gamble, and Sylvain had been gambling with death since the moment she pulled this child from the fire. She chewed a fragment of the dried leaf until it dissolved on her tongue, then pressed her lips to the boy's slack mouth and breathed the medicine into him. For 3 terrible seconds, nothing happened. Then Revan convulsed. His small body arched in her arms, rigid with a seizure that locked every muscle. Sylvain held him through it, her hands steady even as her heart hammered. She counted the seconds. 5, 10, 15. The seizure broke. Revan collapsed against her, limp and gasping. But his heartbeat, when she pressed her ear to him again, was stronger. Irregular, but stronger. The foxglove had kicked his failing heart back into rhythm. It would not last. A few hours at most. But a few hours might be enough. Sylvain forced herself upright. Her vision swam. The forest tilted around her like the deck of a ship in rough water. She took one step, then another, then found the rhythm again. 1 foot, then the other, then again. Brita, the healer in the mountains. These words became her world. She repeated them with every footfall, a chant against despair, a prayer to whatever gods watched over packless wolves and dying princes. The graywood thinned as the ground began to rise. The ancient pines gave way to younger growth, then to bare rock and scrub that offered no shelter from the wind that returned with vicious force. The blizzard had not died. It had been waiting beyond the forest, gathering strength, and now it fell upon Sylvain with a fury that nearly knocked her off her feet. The mountain loomed above her, its face a wall of ice and stone. And somewhere in that wall, hidden in the maze of ridges and crevasses that the wolves called the frost jaw, was a pass. So Ven looked up at the mountain that stood between her and the only hope she had left. Then she began to climb. She almost missed the cave. If Revan had not cried out, a thin, reedy sound that cut through the howl of the wind, Soven would have walked past the narrow fissure in the rock face without seeing it. The blizzard had reduced visibility to nothing. She was climbing blind, her hands raw and bleeding where they gripped the frozen stone, her body operating on something far beyond willpower. But the cry made her turn her head, and the turn revealed a gap in the cliff wall barely wide enough to squeeze through. Soven pushed into the darkness without hesitation. The cave was small, low-ceilinged. The floor was dry stone scattered with the bones of small animals, evidence that something had denned here in warmer seasons. But it was out of the wind, and after 18 hours in the open, that single fact felt like salvation. She lowered Revan to the ground with arms that had forgotten how to bend. Then she collapsed beside him, her back against the stone wall, and for a long time she simply breathed. The silence inside the cave was different from the silence of the gray wood. It was not watchful. It was simply empty. A pocket of still air in a world of chaos. Savannah allowed herself to close her eyes. Just for a moment. She woke to warmth. Not much warmth. A faint pulsing heat against her side, like a coal buried in ash. Soven's eyes snapped open and her hand flew to her belt, searching for a weapon before her brain caught up with her instincts. The warmth was coming from Revan. The boy lay curled against her ribs, his small body pressed into the curve of her torso as if he had crawled there while she slept. And from his skin, from the very center of his chest where the wound gaped like a black mouth, golden light was seeping. Not bright, not the blazing radiance of an alpha healer's power. This was dim, tentative, a candle flame guttering in a draft. But it was unmistakably healing magic. The boy was trying to heal himself. Saven stared at the faint glow with her heart hammering against her ribs. Healing magic in a child this young was extraordinarily rare. In a pup who had not yet undergone his first shift, it should have been impossible. The gift did not typically manifest until adolescence, when the wolf and human halves of the soul began to merge. Unless the child's bloodline carried power that defied the normal rules. The Alpha King's son. Soven reached out and gently peeled back the remnants of Revan's nightshirt to examine the wound. The wolfsbane was still there. The black edges, the poisoned veins, the dead tissue. But at the very center of the gash, where the damage was deepest, a thin line of new skin had formed. Pink and fragile and impossibly delicate, like the first ice on a pond. His magic was fighting the poison, and it was losing. The golden light flickered and dimmed as she watched, the effort of self-repair draining reserves that a 4-year-old body simply did not have. But the fact that he could fight it all, that his power was strong enough to produce even this tiny miracle of regeneration, told Soven something that changed everything. He could be saved. Not by her. Not with winter moss and birch bark and desperate gambles with foxglove. But by someone with real power, someone who could amplify what the boy's body was already trying to do. He could be pulled back from the edge. Brita. If Brita was real. If Brita was still alive. If Brita had the power that Greneth's whispered name implied. Soven wrapped the cloak tighter around the boy and tucked him against her body. He made a small sound in his sleep, not a word this time, but something closer to a sigh. His fingers found her tunic again and held. She looked down at him in the darkness of the cave, at this child she had known for less than a day, and felt something crack open in her chest. Not the bond of a mate, not the bond of blood. Something else. Something older, perhaps. The bond of a creature who chooses, without obligation or instinct or command, to place another life above its own. "I will get you there," she said quietly. "I do not care what stands between us and that mountain. I do not care how many packs turn us away, or how many wolves want you dead. You will live, Revan. I swear it on whatever is left of my name." The boy slept on, his heartbeat steady against her ribs. Outside, the blizzard screamed against the mountain. But inside the cave, for the first time in hours, Soven felt something she had almost forgotten existed: warmth. She allowed herself 2 more hours of rest, drifting in and out of a sleep too shallow to be restorative, but too necessary to refuse. When she woke the second time, the light filtering through the cave entrance had shifted from gray to the dull amber of late afternoon. The storm had eased, not stopped, but pulled back enough to reveal the landscape beyond the fissure. And that landscape told her something that made her blood freeze: tracks, boot prints in the fresh powder. 4 sets of them, climbing the same ridge Soven had climbed, following the same path with methodical precision. They passed within 20 yards of the cave entrance, then continued upward toward the Frostjaw Pass. They were ahead of her. The hunters from the Ashenmere, the dark shapes she had seen at the tree line, had not been waiting at all. They had circled around through the graywood while she stumbled through it, blind, and now they stood between her and the only route to Breda. Soven pressed her back against the cave wall and closed her eyes. Think, think, think. She could not go through the pass, not with trained killers waiting at the top. She could not go back. There was nothing behind her but packs that had slammed their doors and a storm that would finish what the poison had started. She could go over. The thought was insane. The mountain above the Frostjaw Pass was a wall of ice and exposed rock, blasted by winds that could strip flesh from bone. No wolf in their right mind would attempt to scale it in winter. It was a death sentence. But then, so was everything else. Soven looked at the boot prints in the snow, looked at the mountain above, looked at the child sleeping in her arms. "Over it is," she whispered. The climb nearly ended her. Soven had no ropes, no climbing tools, no experience with vertical rock beyond scrambling up creek banks to gather moss. She had frozen hands, a wounded body, and a child strapped to her chest with strips torn from her own cloak, the only way to free her arms for the ascent. But she climbed. She climbed because the alternative was to sit in that cave and wait for death to find them. And Soven had decided, somewhere in the marrow of her bones, that she would not give the hunters or the cold or the poison or any of the powerful forces arrayed against this boy the satisfaction of her surrender. The first 100 feet were the worst. The rock face was sheeted in ice, and every handhold had to be tested, chipped clear, and tested again before she committed her weight. Her fingers left smears of blood on the stone. Her arms shook with a tremor she could not control. And the wind, that merciless, shrieking wind, tore at her body as if personally offended by her refusal to die. Revan was silent against her chest. His warmth had faded since they left the cave, the golden glow of his healing magic retreating as the cold sapped what little strength he had recovered. Soven could feel his heartbeat through the layers of cloth binding them together. It was faster than before. Too fast. The foxglove was wearing off, and without it, his body was compensating for the poison the only way it knew how: by burning itself out. She reached a ledge perhaps 200 feet above the pass and allowed herself to stop. Her legs dangled over empty space. Below, through gaps in the cloud, she could see the Frostjaw Pass winding between the peaks like a white scar. And in that pass, she could see them. 4 figures, dark against the snow. They had stopped moving and were clustered around what appeared to be a makeshift camp at the narrowest point of the pass, waiting. Watching the approach from below, the obvious route any traveler would take. They had not thought to look up. From this height, Soven could see details the blizzard had hidden before. The figures wore matching black leather, the kind of reinforced armor favored by the private guards of the great houses. Each carried weapons, swords at their hips and crossbows slung across their backs, and on their left shoulders, barely visible at this distance but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for, was the sigil of a clenched fist wrapped in silver chain. House Catherine, Lord Halvard's personal hunters. Soven's stomach clenched. These were not common soldiers or opportunistic wolves looking to collect a bounty. These were trained killers, the same kind who had stormed the Ashenmere estate with wolfsbane weapons and butchered an entire household in the space of a single evening. They had been sent to ensure that what had begun at the burning manor was finished in the frozen wild. No witnesses, no survivors, no heir. As she watched, one of the figures separated from the group and shifted to wolf form, a massive black-furred beast that put its nose to the snow and began to track in widening circles. Searching for the trail that should have led through the pass but instead had vanished at the cave. They knew she had not come through. They would figure out why soon enough. Soven turned away from the ledge and looked up. The mountain continued above her, steeper than before, the rock giving way to pure ice near the summit. Beyond the peak, if her understanding of the geography was correct, the far slope descended into a valley that Greneth had not named. The valley where Brita lived. If she could get over the top, she could descend on the other side before the hunters realized she had bypassed their ambush entirely. If she began to climb again. The next 2 hours existed outside of time. Soven's world contracted to the space between her bleeding hands and the next hold. She did not think about the hunters below. She did not think about the distance remaining. She did not think about the fact that her body had passed beyond exhaustion into a state that she had no word for, a condition where muscles moved, not because the brain commanded them to, but because stopping was simply not programmed into whatever stubborn, irrational force was keeping her upright. She thought about Revan, about the way his fingers had closed around hers in the burning nursery, about the ghost of his name breathed against her throat, about the golden light seeping from his wound like a prayer made visible, about the fact that somewhere in this broken world, a child existed who had done nothing wrong, who had committed no crime, who had simply been born into the wrong bloodline at the wrong time, and who would die in the snow unless one Omega, one pack less, powerless, insignificant Omega, refused to put him down. The summit came without warning. One moment she was climbing. The next, her hand reached up and found nothing but air. She hauled herself over the lip of the ridge and collapsed on the flat stone at the top, gasping, shaking, and every muscle in her body screaming for mercy. The wind hit her from the far side with enough force to slide her across the ice. She dug her fingers into a crack in the rock and held, pressing her body flat over Revan's to shield him from the blast. And then, through a gap in the racing clouds, she saw it. The valley below was a bowl of darkness and snow, ringed by mountains on 3 sides. At its center, where a frozen stream caught the last light of the dying day, a thin column of smoke rose from a structure she could barely make out. A cottage. In the middle of nowhere. Exactly where Greneth had said it would be. Brita. A sound escaped Soven's throat that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. She could not tell the difference anymore. She began the descent. It was faster than the climb, and more dangerous. The far slope was steep, but not vertical, covered in deep snow that alternately supported her weight and gave way without warning, plunging her thigh deep into drifts that sucked at her legs like quicksand. She fell more times than she could count, always curling around Revan, always taking the impact on her own back, her own shoulders, her own already battered body. Halfway down, Revan opened his eyes. Soven felt him stir against her chest and looked down to find 2 amber eyes staring up at her. Not the unfocused gaze of delirium. Clear eyes, present eyes, eyes that saw her and, against all logic, chose to trust what they saw. Cold, Revan whispered. Soven pressed her cheek to his forehead. He was burning with fever now, his body's last defense against the poison that was killing him. The poison and the foxglove were at war inside his tiny frame, and neither side was winning. "I know," she said, "but we are almost there. Can you see the smoke?" Revan's eyes tracked to where she pointed. The cottage was closer now, perhaps a mile across the valley floor. The smoke rose in a steady thread, unhurried and calm, as if the occupant of that small dwelling had no idea that a desperate Omega and a fading prince were stumbling toward her door. "Who lives there?" Revan asked. His voice was barely a whisper, but the fact that he was forming sentences that his mind was still working behind those fever-bright eyes sent a spike of fierce hope through Soven's chest. "Someone who can help you." The other wolves would not help. It was not a question. Even through the haze of poison and pain and the fog of a consciousness that kept sliding toward darkness, the boy had understood what had happened at Dunhallow, at the Greneth border. He had heard, and he had understood, and the flat acceptance in his small voice was the most heartbreaking thing Soven had ever heard. "No," she said. "They would not." "Why?" "Because they are afraid of what you are. Because the wolves who should protect you have decided that protecting you costs too much. Because this world is cruel to the small and the powerless and the inconvenient, and you, little prince, are all three." She did not say any of that. "Because they forgot what it means to be wolves," she said instead. "But I have not. And neither has the woman in that cottage. Hold on to me, Revan. We are almost home." The boy's fingers tightened on her tunic, and Soven walked the last mile on legs that should not have been able to carry her, toward a column of smoke that rose like a signal fire against the darkening sky. Behind her, at the summit of the mountain she had just crossed, a howl rose into the evening air. Long, searching, furious. The hunters had found her trail. The cottage door opened before Soven could knock. The woman who stood in the threshold was ancient, white hair in a single braid past her waist, eyes the pale gold of winter sunlight, sharp and utterly unsurprised. "You took longer than I expected," Brita said. "Bring the child inside. Questions could wait." Soven laid Revan on the wooden table and Brita was already working, her gnarled fingers peeling back the nightshirt to expose the wolfsbane wound. "Third-generation military compound," Brita murmured, pressing her palm to his chest. Golden light, brilliant and steady, blazed from her hand. "He should be dead. The fact that he is not tells me his bloodline is stronger than they feared." The healing took hours. Soven sat against the wall and endured every cry the boy made, feeling each one like a blade between her ribs. Brita's power poured into Revan in waves, pushing the wolfsbane back inch by inch, the blackened flesh retreating, new skin spreading across the wound like frost on glass. When it was over, Revan breathed in deep, even rhythms. The wound was closed, clean, free of poison, alive. Soven let her head fall back and wept. She had not allowed herself to cry. Not once during the blizzard, the rejections, the climb. Now, listening to a child breathe easily for the first time in 2 days, she broke. Brita let her, then handed her something hot and bitter. "Drink, and listen carefully." The old healer's eyes hardened. The Alpha King did not vanish. He was betrayed. Halvard of House Kethrin poisoned him with wolfsbane, severed him from his wolf, and seized the Alpha Council. Kavrin's mate fled with the boy to the Ashenmere. Halvard sent his hunters 3 days ago. She paused. "Every pack in the realm has been warned. Harbor the heir and House Kethrin marches on your borders." So that was why. Not cowardice. Calculated terror. Halvard had made the price of compassion high enough to ensure no alpha would pay it. "Is Kavrin alive?" Soven asked. "The wolfsbane that holds him is weakening. His wolf is fighting free. But he does not know his mate is dead. He does not know his son lives." Brita moved to the window. "And right now, we have a more immediate problem." Torchlight flickered between the trees. Dozens of flames, moving in a coordinated line toward the cottage. The hunters had found her trail, and they had brought reinforcements. "Take the boy," Soven said. "The mountains. You know this land. Get him out." Brita stared at her. "Against 20 wolves, you will last minutes. Then you will have minutes." Brita studied her for a long moment. Something shifted behind those ancient eyes. "You are more than you think you are, Soven." A howl split the night. Brita scooped Revan from the table, wrapping him in furs. The boy's amber eyes opened, finding Soveni across the room. "Where are you going?" he asked. The flat calm of a child who had already learned that protectors tend to disappear. Soven knelt beside him and smoothed the hair from his forehead. "I am going to stand at the door, and I am going to make sure nobody comes through it. Will you come back?" The question cracked something inside her she had not known was still intact. "I will try. But listen to me, Revan. You are not what they say you are. You are not a problem to be solved or a bloodline to be erased. You are a brave, strong boy who held on when everything said to let go, and that matters." Revan's hand found hers. "You did not put me down," he whispered. "Everyone said to put me down, but you did not. No, and I never will." Brita slipped through the back door with the boy. The darkness swallowed them. Soven opened the front door and stepped into the snow. The lead hunter stopped 20 yards from the cottage. Cold eyes. The bored patience of a wolf who killed often enough to find it tedious. "Step aside. We want the boy." "No." The hunter tilted his head. "You understand what happens if you resist." "I understand." Soven planted her feet and felt her wolf rise, not with the power of an alpha, but with something simpler. The same force that had carried her through the blizzard and over the mountain and past every slammed door. Stubbornness. Pure, unbreakable stubbornness. She shifted. Her wolf was small, gray-brown, unremarkable. But when the hunter's massive black wolf lunged for her throat, she was not there. She was faster than she should have been. Weeks of running and climbing had stripped away everything unnecessary, leaving only speed and the absolute refusal to fall. She twisted under his lunge and tore through his tendon. 2 more charged. She dodged the first, took a glancing blow from the second, was back on her feet before they could close. Blood ran from her shoulder. Pain screamed through her body. She could not win. But winning had never been the point. Every second she held them was a second Brita gained. A wolf caught her from behind. Jaws closed on her back leg. Bone cracked. She went down. 3 wolves pinned her. The lead hunter stood over her, wolfsbane blade drawn. Brave, stupid, but brave. And then the mountain came apart. The sound was not a howl, it was something older. The ground shook. Trees snapped at the valley's edge. A wolf burst through the shattered timber, the size of a draft horse, its fur deep burnished gold, its eyes blazing white-hot. The Alpha King had broken free. Kavrin hit the clearing like a thunderbolt. The first 3 hunters died before they could shift. The rest scattered. The lead hunter managed one swing before the king's paw shattered his arm and sent the poisoned blade spinning into darkness. It was over in minutes. Then those incandescent eyes turned to Soven. She lay broken in the snow, too damaged to shift back. Shattered leg, gashes across her flanks, her body channeling everything into simply not dying. The Alpha King lowered his massive head. His nostrils flared, taking in her scent. Blood, exhaustion, wolfsbane, and his son. She smelled of his son. Warmth flooded through her. Alpha healing, raw and undiluted, pouring into her broken body like sunlight into a dark room. Bones knit, flesh closed. Pain receded like a tide. Soven shifted back to human, gasping, whole, staring up at the golden wolf who had saved her life. Kavrin shifted. The man who knelt before her was gaunt, marked by months of imprisonment. but his eyes held a fire that Wolfsbane had failed to extinguish. "Where is my son?" "Safe. With Brita." The king's entire body shuddered with a breath that sounded like it had been held for months. "How did you find us?" Soven asked. "The blood bond. When my wolf broke free of the Wolfsbane, I could feel him. Faint, like a heartbeat at the edge of hearing. It pulled me north, through the mountains." His voice fractured. "I almost did not make it in time." "You carried him." A statement, not an inquiry. He knew. Scent and instinct had told him everything. Every pack turned him away, and you carried him. They were afraid. Halvard made them afraid. Soven pushed herself upright. "Punishing wolves for being frightened solves nothing. End Halvard. End the threat. Then ask your kingdom why an Omega with no power was the only wolf willing to protect your child." The Alpha King stared at her. Then he bowed his head. Not a nod. A bow. Deep and deliberate. From the most powerful wolf in 3 kingdoms to a packless Omega kneeling in blood-stained snow. "What is your name?" "Soven." "Tell me what you want." "Anything." She looked at this broken king and thought of everything she could ask for. A home, a pack, wealth, recognition. "I want to see him smile," she said. "I have not seen him smile yet." Kavrin made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Then let us go find him. Together." They found Brita in a cave on the northern ridge, Revan asleep in her arms. When the boy heard Soveni's voice, he woke. When he saw her, his face did something she had been waiting for since the burning nursery. He smiled, small, tentative. The fragile expression of a child not yet sure the world had finished taking, but real, and aimed at her. Revan reached for Soven, and she gathered him close, and for a long time neither spoke. Kavrin knelt beside them. His hand trembled over his son's head until Revan looked up at the stranger with amber eyes that mirrored his own. "This is your father," Soven said gently. Revan studied the king with grave seriousness. Then his small hand touched the scars on Kavrin's wrist where Wolfsbane shackles had held him. "You are hurt too," Revan said. The Alpha King's composure broke. He pulled his son into his arms and wept. In the weeks that followed, Erindril was reborn. Kavrin returned to the capital as a father with nothing left to lose. House Kethrin fell in a single night, Halvard dragged from his stolen seat. The Alpha Council was dissolved and rebuilt, its new charter carved in stone. No wolf is too small to protect. No pack too weak to matter. The wolves who had turned Revan away were not punished. Soven had asked for that. But they came, one by one. Vasek of Dunhallow arrived first, his iron eyes unable to meet hers. Greneth came last, bringing healers and a letter that said simply, "I should have been braver." Soven refused every title, every land grant, and every seat on the new council. She asked for one thing, a cottage at the edge of the royal grounds, close enough to hear Revan laughing in the gardens, far enough to stand in her own space and know she had earned it through a choice made in the snow, when the world said, "Put him down," and she said no. On a warm spring evening, Soven sat on her steps watching the sunset. Revan sat beside her, a book of wolf tales in his lap. The scar on his chest had faded to a thin silver line. "Soveni, why did you carry me, when no one else would?" She looked at the boy who had changed everything, at the amber eyes that held the fire of kings and the softness of a child who still reached for her hand when the dark felt too large. "Because you needed to be carried," she said, "and I was there." Revan leaned against her shoulder. Together they watched the light paint the sky gold and rose. In the distance, wolves began to howl, not war, not grief. A song of gratitude, carried from every pack that had learned, through the stubborn courage of one Omega, what it truly meant to be wolves. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story.